time for Dawnshards. Again! I got so much out of my last lesson for time, I decided to keep on as I started and delve even deeper. For part 1, please check out my previous video, where I explain why the two unknown Dawnshards are Remain and End, and go over what we know, or can infer, about the history of the 4 Dawnshards, and how they influence the known arcana. This is mostly the information I thought was a little too specific or in the weeds to include in the last, so this lesson might seem a bit rambly and disjointed, but I thought the information was important enough to merit a video. Plus, my last video did the best I've ever done, so I guess people really like Dawnshard content. Either way, class is in session. There was an interesting word of Brandon which has come to my attention recently. He said that we've seen a character suffering a torment on screen, but that we wouldn't be able to notice it yet. I would almost say my Frost idea from last video, that his resistance to action is a torment from the Remain Dawnshard, is too obvious for him to say that we couldn't notice. But since Remain is unconfirmed, maybe this is what he meant. If I get a chance at Nexus this year, this might be what I ask. Don't forget to subscribe so you'll be alerted to the content I upload in December around Nexus. There's one thing in particular I thought of after writing up the previous lesson I really should have included. Another reason why I think the basic structure I propose, why these commands, has legs. The Hero of Ages famously classifies the metallic arts of Scadrial as and positive, and neutral, and negative. I don't think that's just a random one-off designation. Wouldn't it make sense for this to apply to the Dawnshards too? Exist, the end positive one. By the time you're done, there's more than you started with. End, the end negative one. By the time you're done, there's less than you started with. And change and remain in between. However much you started with, that's how much you end with. Either entirely unchanged, or different, but still the same amount. Like how a boulder can be soul cast into that much grain. No more, no less. Next up is a very speculative theory. I think each Dawnshard will end up having a metal. This is a pretty weak theory since the only 2 metals I can reference are aluminum and silver, which match the 2 Dawnshards which have been confirmed. So it's a theory based on a theory. But something weird is happening with silver and aluminum, and this feels like it could help explain. We know aluminum is immune to investiture. It and some of its alloys can't be soulcast, can't be pushed, can't be forged, deepest ones cannot go through it, etc. We get no explanation for this, and what I believe is, it's a metallic expression of the Dawnshard Remain. No matter what you try to command it to do, it embodies the unstoppable command to stay as it is, and refuses. Let's look at some other properties of aluminum. In Furukumi, it stores identity, which itself is kind of a force of resistance. Identity is something of a lock on various powers. It is the part of a person's soul which says, you are such, and which does not care to be changed. Soul stamps only work for a day on humans, when they'll last indefinitely on inanimate objects, and I believe that's because humans have more powerful identity. A person's metal minds or their lashings are locked to themselves because of their identity. And finally, look at allomancy. This seems like a very odd relationship at first. Here, aluminum doesn't keep things stable, it destroys. In fact, it destroys itself. Isn't that odd? Aluminum can't be affected by any investiture. Yet here we see it destroyed. I think the context provides a clue. Allomancy is the arcana of preservation. Whether you believe in the theory that the combination of Dawnshards created the intents or not, more on that in a moment, preservation is the ultimate expression of total stasis. Nothing decaying, nothing changing, nothing new being created. Like aluminum, everything remaining unchanged, forever. Maybe this is the context. That preservation, as the shard most closely aligned with Remain, is the only shard with enough connection to actually destroy aluminum. Kind of a the call is coming from inside the house kind of deal. Speaking of destruction, in the creepiest segue ever, let's talk about silver. Silver is less about what is done to it and more about what it can do. It seems that it can be pushed upon, soulcast, all that good stuff. But if an investiture is ongoing or alive somehow, silver has the curious ability to end it. Silver is fatal to shades, a whip of sand currently being mastered, and aether spores. We also see it terminate the Luhel connection to Midnight Essence, though we've only seen that in relation to spores. Either way, I suspect you can tell where I'm going here. I think silver is the expression of the command to end. Any kinetic investiture, it seems to be able to stop. Any investiture with any kind of life, it seems to be able to kill. I think this is pretty solid evidence that silver has some relationship with an overpowering command to stop. We also know about threnodite silver change, which can apparently anchor through a cognitive anomaly, whatever that means. Is that literally silver? Does it really matter if it came from threnody, and if so, why? What even is a cognitive anomaly? We know that Nulthus has one, but what does it do? What does it mean? I don't think we know enough to really make any kind of guess, but the one thing I'll point out is threnody is the world I think we can easily say is most associated with death. I can buy that there is something to the idea that silver from threnody has some resonance that makes it even more unique. There are more scraps about silver from 2 more places, but those are unpublished, so you'll have to either wait or find somewhere to discuss it with me where I can talk about unpublished works. If my speculation is true, this would mean there's 2 more metals which have some kind of innate response to investiture. What could those be? Why haven't we seen them before? Well, we saw silver in Era 1 of Mistborn, but there wasn't the kind of kinetic investiture it interacts with around for us to see it do anything. So we didn't know silver was special. Maybe there are metals we haven't seen. We just haven't seen their properties? Some normal, mundane metals such as aluminum and silver are, but with curious realmatic traits. Maybe ones which would be difficult to refine with the technology of the era and the Cosmere thus far, so we haven't really seen them? Tungsten, platinum, cesium? Or could they be something we have seen, but don't realize their powers are Dawnshard related? Dragonsteel? The cores of either Braze or Canticle? The light of Canticle's sun gets a tremendous amount of power, which it lacks if it passes the planet by. Maybe the power of the Dawnshard of Exist suffuses the core, and it enhances the power of the sunlight to magma-churning levels? Who knows? This is all wild speculation for now. Getting back to another popular theory, the idea that the intents of the shards are what they are, in general, because of how they were split by the Dawnshards. I do think this is the case, though. Again, the best evidence is based on my own speculation for the 2 remaining Dawnshards. The theory in general goes that the 4 Dawnshards were used to rip Adonalsium into 4 pieces, and then used on each of those 4 pieces. Which means that at one point there was a quarter of Adonalsium that was the closest to the Exist Dawnshard, but then that quarter was split again, so now there will be a chunk that's still mostly Exist, but some change too. Which means there should be 4 shards which are pure expressions of whatever the 4 Dawnshards are. The trouble is, we know the names of all the shards, but not necessarily what that truly means as far as their intent. The way the word change is oversimplified and doesn't really define the full command of the Dawnshard. For Exist, I would say either endowment, constantly giving with no thought of return, or possibly invention, turning pure ideas into reality, could fit. For change, maybe whimsy, depending on what that shardic intent ends up truly meaning. However, if all the speculation up to here is right, we have clear contenders for remain and end. Preservation and ruin. One intent to just keep everything exactly as it is forever, and another to break everything down. Burn it all. There's one final theory I've heard, and want to bring up. The idea is that Hoid will have 4 apprentices, and each will end up as a Dawnshard. I'm not sure what they'll all do with them, but I buy it. Ryzen has changed, clearly, though she's not yet been Hoid's apprentice. Still, there's time for her to become it, and she wouldn't be the first novice world hopper he's taken under his wing. Since I think Frost has remain, it's not too big a stretch to think somehow it'll get passed down to Starlight. Someone who herself has had to suffer for years, trapped in one form, literally unable to change, as is her nature, under a constraint that stops the use of most of her innate abilities. I've heard there's an idea that one of them will have something to do with Fires of December, the latest in Hoid's travails, but I won't discuss unpublished works in a public setting like this, so come back after it comes out in a few months. And lastly, Zellion. He's already born Exist, but I don't think he'll be going back to it. Remember in the last lesson, I said that I thought the end Dawnshard is with the Night Brigade. Much like Sazed's journey in Hero of Ages, Zellion seems to have undergone an arc from being a bright, idealistic person bearing the Dawnshard of beginnings to a dark and bitter soldier who just happens to be the bearer of a mostly dead weapon/old friend. And at the end of Sunlit Man, started to make his peace with living in that darkness. With him not able to stop running as long as the Night Brigade remains at his throat, I wonder if the conclusion of one of his arcs will be finding a way to take the fight to the Night Brigade, defeating them once and for all, and taking on End himself to round out the cast. In fact, for one last added bit of craziness, Zellion has become a man of two homeworlds, native enough to Canticle that people can give him their investiture. And the first time he receives some, he describes it as feeling like an ignition within him. With this infusion, and with now being a native to a planet of Threnodite refugees, would it be possible that he'd rise as a shade at this point when he's visited by Old Iron Eyes? Can you imagine Zellion as a shade, bearing the Dawnshard of End? Wildly speculative, but my videos always trend in that direction. I find it makes for the most robust conversation. I have heard other ideas buzzing around the fandom. I almost didn't add this section because I don't want to be seen as a troll tearing down the ideas others have. But I've drafted these sections, and I think I can respectfully present counter-evidence without being rude, so I'm going to give it a try. If you are offended when I present reasons why I don't think a theory you like holds water, I do apologize. It's not my intent to upset anyone. I just want to have an open debate on these topics. The two most common ideas I've heard for the unknown Dawnshards are bind and feel. I'm going to go over what I know of support for these theories and why I don't endorse them. Since these are not my ideas, I can't claim to be fairly representing all the support, but I am doing my best. If you know of a reason to support these ideas I haven't included, I would ask that you respectfully note in the comments, and I will try to respond. Maybe I'll make an Instagram reply if I get some really juicy ideas. The first, bind. Support for this one is pretty clear. It's outright stated in the text. Taking the Dawnshard, known to bind any creature voidish or mortal, he crawled up the steps crafted for heralds, 10 strides tall apiece, towards the grand temple above. So why don't I buy that? First, this is very vague and fantastical. It reads like a nursery rhyme. Realistically, how can someone crawl up steps which are 20 to 30 feet tall? This whole scrap from a poem strikes me as not intended to be taken literally. Second, while it talks of binding, keep in mind that this is from a Rosharan source. It could mean that particular Dawnshard was meant to bind. Or it could be, like having the Final Empire, local scholars thought they knew how the metals were arranged and gold was paired with Atium. They did the best they could with imperfect information. We know Rosharans have followed honor for 10,000 years, even before humans came over from Alaswa. The Dawn Singers worshipped oaths and binding. I don't think it's unreasonable to speculate that the message from this allegorical poem was the Dawnshard is incredibly powerful, the most powerful thing we can think of is binding, ergo, the Dawnshard must be the most powerful bond of all. I'm not saying this can't be evidence that there is a bind Dawnshard. I'm just saying it's not proof, and there's at least one other explanation which is just as plausible. If there were more evidence, that would be one thing, but on the basis of this one citation, it just feels like a reach to me. I haven't actually heard this one, but another reason I can imagine for having a bind be a Dawnshard is that we know there are a few fundamental concepts throughout the Cosmere, and connection is one of them. So having a Dawnshard bind, which is all about connection, makes a degree of sense. However, the other known aspects are things like fortune, identity, intent, and investiture. And I don't see how exist or change matches with any of those, which suggests the Dawnshards aren't matched to these fundamental forces. I could be wrong. Maybe there are other forces which better match exist and change, or maybe the one that's not like the others, put that in our trusty cadmium bubble, is bind, which ties to a fundamental force when the other three Dawnshards don't. Again, want to reiterate, I'm not claiming I can prove that these ideas are false. I'm just saying I don't think the evidence for them is very strong, and I don't personally subscribe. I understand the reasoning for feel a little less. This is the one where I think there must be more of a basis, so please let me know your reasoning if you support this theory. To the best of my knowledge, the main reason for this theory is one of reverse engineering. As I've said before, there's an idea I do subscribe to, supported at least a little by the mural from Dawnshard. It's the idea that the shards were created by using the Dawnshards to tear Adonalsium into 4 chunks, then using them again on each chunk to further break it down. So as I already said, every shard will be either a pure expression of one Dawnshard's command or a mix of 2. People have tried to use this model to reverse engineer the Dawnshard commands. And basically, since there are so many shards whose names seem to be some kind of emotion, that must mean there's a Dawnshard about emotions. The thing is, I don't think that's a valid path for us to be taking right now. We know so little about most of the shards. We have their names, but that's not enough to understand their intents. Until we learned a lot more about honor, it wasn't clear that it was the shard of oaths and binding, rather than some other possible interpretation of the word honor. I've even made this entire other video, which you can check out here, about how I think we see enough evidence of ambition and endowment, specifically being opposites, like ruin and preservation, that we can narrow their intents down to things like selfishness and selflessness. So that's why I think we can't reliably reverse engineer yet. We've got, by now, a pretty good grasp of the actual intents of only a handful of shards. Trying to guess the intents of the rest, then group them, then extrapolate out what could have grouped them that way, that just strikes me as too many layers of guesswork to be viable. At that point, it's really just going off one person's personal vibes. I have one last point to bring up for bind and feel, at least together. If those are both right, we've got exist, change, bind, and feel. Those are just 4 random words. I can't see any structure to them. For something this important, this foundational to the Cosmere, this primal, I would expect there to be some underlying logic. I could be wrong. Maybe Brandon was just feeling those 4 things, and since the Cosmere of his creation, that would be enough. Or maybe there's a structure I can't see. But I would support this theory more if anyone could come up with some reason why these 4 fit a pattern, even with the one is different from the other's caveat. Nope, stay in your cadmium bubble, it's not time yet. When I've proposed end as a Dawnshard before, I've heard as a rebuttal, but that's just a kind of change. To which I say, so is everything. Calling something into existence is a type of change. Binding something is a type of change. Making something feel is a type of change. I bring this up to point out what I think change actually is. I believe this is a end-neutral Dawnshard. The difference between changing something and calling into existence or ending existence, I think, is that change reshapes what is there. It doesn't add or subtract. You can't soulcast nothing. You can soulcast air, but not nothing. If you want to turn a stone into smoke, it will have immense pressure, the same mass of smoke packed into the density of stone. By that reckoning, I wouldn't consider something like rioting to be change. I'd say that's exist. You're increasing the amount of motion. If you disagree, feel free to explain to me the difference between exist and change, and why exist, which is healing and growth, isn't just a kind of change in the comments below. You can say that healing something isn't a change because it's reverting them, but if you're healing someone, their current state is injured. You're changing them from injured to healthy, and a change back is as much a change as any other. And finally, one last note. And yes, now we can finally remove this from the cadmium bubble. There was a word of Brandon saying one Dawnshard is different from all the rest. Honestly, I ignore this. It seems kind of meaningless. In a group of 4 things, you can generally find reasons any one of them has a distinction from all the other 3. For my set, perhaps remain is the odd one out because it's not included in the typical creation myth triumvirate. Maybe it's end for being the Dawnshard which seems most opposed to creating the Cosmere. Maybe it's exist because that one has been held by Hoid for so long and he's changed it somehow. Whatever Brandon was thinking when he wrote this, it feels like one of those prophecies that's only going to make sense after we see the full answer. And here endeth the second part of the lesson. I hope you've all enjoyed back-to-back months of Dawnshards. Next month's lesson will be something of a vanity project, a deep dive into my favorite 2 metals in Allomancy, itself my favorite arcana across the Cosmere. Honestly, it wouldn't be wrong to say I made this channel just so I could talk about Mistborn. Until next time, class dismissed.